6 days. 6 days without food, and the taste of rust from the ship's water pipes had become the only flavor left in their mouths. In the belly of a Liberty ship somewhere in the Atlantic, 300 German women pressed against each other in the darkness, their stomachs no longer growling, but silent, surrendered to the emptiness. Among them, 23-year-old Helena Schmidt clutched her knees to her chest, feeling the sharp edges of her own ribs through the thin fabric of what remained of her Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform. She had stopped counting the hours after day 4. Now she only counted breaths, wondering which one might be her last. The woman beside her, barely 19, had stopped moving that morning. No one checked if she was alive or dead. There was no point. They were all headed to the same place anyway. America. The land where, according to everything they had been told, German prisoners were tortured, experimented on, and worked to death in desert camps. The propaganda minister himself had warned them. Better to die fighting than to be captured by the Americans. But they hadn't died fighting. They had been captured near Cherbourg when the Allied forces swept through France. And now they were cargo human ballast in the bottom of a ship that reeked of engine oil and despair. When the engines finally stopped, Helena thought it was the end. The cargo door opened and sunlight poured in like liquid fire, blinding eyes that had seen nothing but darkness for nearly 2 weeks. She tried to stand but collapsed immediately. Her legs were water, her vision spinning in circles that made her stomach heave with nothing left to expel. American soldiers appeared as shadows against the light, their voices sharp and foreign. But instead of clubs or rifles raised to strike, hands reached down, lifted, carried. The first thing that didn't make sense was the smell. Not the sulfur and smoke of a burning country, but something else. Grass. Wind that carried the scent of cattle and earth. When her eyes finally adjusted, Helena found herself looking at something impossible. A harbor, yes, but beyond it, a city standing whole and untouched. No bomb craters, no collapsed buildings, no fires burning on the horizon like the funeral pyres of civilization. Houston, Texas stretched out under a September sun as if the war existed only in some other universe. They were loaded onto trains, then trucks, each transition bringing new waves of panic. This was it. They were being taken to the execution grounds. The older women whispered prayers. The younger ones went silent, preparing themselves for whatever horror came next. But as the trucks rolled through the Texas countryside, the world outside the canvas flaps told a different story. Children played in front yards. Farmers waved from their fields. Towns with ice cream shops and hardware stores passed by, as if millions weren't dying an ocean away. It was September of 1944, and America looked like a country that had never heard of war. For Helena, raised in Hamburg, where you could cross from one town to another in an hour, the vastness alone was incomprehensible. Here they drove for half a day and saw nothing but land stretching to the horizon. Cattle grazing in pastures bigger than entire German provinces. Oil derricks pumping like mechanical insects against an endless sky. This was the America they had been told was on the verge of collapse. This was the nation that would crumble under German might. The propaganda had been specific and terrifying. Americans were mongrels. Joseph Goebbels had said, a mixture of races without culture or honor. They would rape German women, use them for medical experiments, work them until they dropped dead in their fields. The guards would be sadists chosen specifically for their cruelty. Every German soldier and auxiliary had been told the same thing. Death was preferable to American captivity. But when the trucks finally stopped at a camp near Hearne, Texas, what waited for them defied every expectation. There were fences, yes, and guard towers. But the men who met them weren't screaming. They weren't even carrying rifles. Instead, men in wide-brimmed hats and worn denim stood beside the military guards, looking more curious than hostile. One of them, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and surprisingly gentle eyes, actually tipped his hat. "Afternoon, ladies. Y'all look like you could use a good meal." A meal. Helena almost laughed. It had to be a trick. Give them hope, then snatch it away. That's how torture worked. Build them up before breaking them down. She had heard the stories from the Eastern Front, knew what prisoners could expect. But the cowboy, for that's what he clearly was, just stood there with what looked like genuine concern on his weathered face. "Name's Tom Blackwood," he continued through the translator. "I run a ranch about 10 miles from here. You ladies will be helping us out once you get your strength back. But first things first, let's get you fed." Fed. The word hung in the air like something alien, something from a language Helena had forgotten how to speak. They were separated into groups of 30 and led not to punishment blocks, but to a long wooden building that smelled of something impossible. Food, real food. Not the thin gruel of the ship or the black bread of wartime rations, but something that made their empty stomachs clench in desperate hope. Inside, tables were set, actual tables with plates and forks and napkins. Cowboys and local women bustled around with pots and pans, and the smell was overwhelming. Meat, vegetables, fresh bread. It was too much. Several women began crying. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. "This isn't real," whispered a voice behind Helena. She turned to see Christina Muller, a 30-year-old nurse from Berlin, her face hard with suspicion. "They're playing with us. It's psychological warfare." Helena nodded. "Of course. Make them think they were safe. Make them drop their guard, then spring the real torture." It was sophisticated, she had to admit. Crueler than beatings because it played with hope itself. The cowboys and guards seemed confused by the women's reluctance to approach the tables. They stood there, 30 skeletal figures in tattered uniforms, staring at a feast they couldn't believe existed. "What's wrong with them?" one cowboy muttered to another. "They're scared," Tom Blackwood said quietly. "Can you blame them? Lord knows what they've been told about us." He stepped forward slowly, the way you might approach a spooked horse. He picked up a piece of bread from the table, tore it in half, and took a bite himself. Then he held out the other half to Helena. She stared at it, her hand trembling. 6 days without food, and here was bread, white and soft and impossible. But her mind screamed warnings. Poison, drugs, some kind of trick. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. 30 starving women facing tables loaded with food, unable to bridge the gap between their hunger and their terror. The cowboys exchanged glances, clearly baffled. These weren't the fierce Nazi fanatics they had expected. These were terrified young women who looked like they might collapse at any moment. Finally, it was the youngest among them who broke. Ava Klein, barely 18, took a stumbling step forward, then another. Her hand reached out, shaking like a leaf in wind, and touched the bread. When nothing happened, no guards rushing forward, no laughter at her weakness, she picked it up. The first bite was so small, it was almost nothing. The second was larger. By the third, tears were streaming down her face. "Es ist echtes Essen," she whispered. "It's real food." That's when the dam broke. Helena found herself moving forward with the others, her body overruling her mind's protests. The first taste of beef stew was like swallowing sunlight. The bread might have been made of clouds. After 6 days of nothing, every flavor was an explosion, every texture a miracle. Some women ate too quickly and became sick. Others could only manage a few bites before their shrunken stomachs protested. But they all ate tears, mixing with the first real food they had seen since France. All except one. Christina Muller sat alone in the corner, arms crossed, stomach growling audibly in the quiet room. She watched her comrades with something between pity and disgust, her jaw set in grim determination. Tom Blackwood stood back, his hat in his hands, watching these women discover that their worst fears were lies. He had expected prisoners, enemies, maybe even some resentment or anger. But what he saw were human beings reduced to their most basic need, grateful for the simple act of being fed. One of his ranch hands, an older man named Samuel Hughes, sidled up beside him. "Never seen anything like it," Samuel said quietly. "They really thought we were going to starve them." "Appears so," Tom replied. "Makes you wonder what else they've been told." As Helena ate slowly, carefully, she kept waiting for the trap to spring, for someone to laugh and snatch the food away, for the real torture to begin. But it never came. Instead, a cowboy refilled her water glass. A local woman brought out a pie, an actual apple pie, and began cutting slices. The guards chatted casually among themselves, paying the prisoners no more attention than you'd give to any group of hungry workers at a meal. The sun was setting by the time the women were led to their quarters. Not cages or punishment cells, but actual barracks, with beds and blankets and windows that opened to let in the evening air. Helena lay down on a mattress, the first she had felt in weeks, her stomach full for the first time in months. Outside, she could hear cowboys calling to each other as they finished their day's work, their voices carrying across the Texas plains like something from another world. She thought about the propaganda, about everything she had been told. Americans were supposed to be monsters, but monsters didn't feed their enemies apple pie. They didn't tip their hats and say, "Ma'am." They didn't look concerned when you were too scared to eat. As sleep finally took her, Helena realized that either everything she had been taught was a lie or this was the most elaborate deception in the history of warfare. Tomorrow would tell which one it was. But tonight, for the first time since her capture, she wasn't hungry. And that simple fact was already beginning to crack the foundations of everything she believed about the enemy she had been taught to hate. The morning sun crept through the barrack windows, and with consciousness came the familiar ache of hunger. Helena's eyes snapped open, her body already prepared for disappointment. Last night had been a dream, surely, a hallucination brought on by starvation. But the mattress beneath her was real. The blanket was real. And from somewhere outside came a smell that made her stomach clench with desperate hope. Bacon, coffee, the impossible scent of breakfast. Around her, the other women were stirring, each one going through the same process of remembering, doubting, hoping. Christina sat up slowly, her face drawn and pale from a night of voluntary starvation, her nurse's training making her suspicious of everything. "It's a psychological tactic," she whispered to the woman next to her. "Feed us once to make the starvation worse." Classic conditioning. But when the door opened and Tom Blackwood appeared hat in hand and a slight smile on his weathered face, he didn't look like a man planning torture. "Morning, ladies. Breakfast is ready when you are. Take your time." Take your time, as if time was something they owned, as if they had any choice in their fate. But there were no guards pushing them forward, no rifles pointed at their backs, just an open door and that maddening smell of food drifting on the morning air. They moved as a group, still suspicious, still waiting for the trap. The mess hall was already busy with activity. Cowboys sat at long tables eating and talking in their drawling English. The kitchen was visible through a serving window, where local women and camp cooks worked over massive grills and steaming pots. And their table was set again. Not with scraps or gruel, but with a spread that belonged in a fever dream. Platters of eggs, scrambled and fried, bacon in piles that seemed obscene in their abundance, biscuits golden and steaming, gravy white and thick, butter real butter, not the gray substitute they had known for years, jam in 3 different colors, coffee, black and strong, and pitchers of actual milk. Fresh milk, not powdered, not watered down, but white and rich and impossible. Ingrid Weber, a 30-year-old signals operator from Munich, stood frozen at the table's edge. In her mind, she could hear her training officer's voice from 1942. "The Americans will try to break you with false kindness. They'll offer you comfort food friendship. It's all lies. The moment you trust them, they'll destroy you. But hunger is stronger than propaganda." And when young Eva, the girl who had broken first the night before, reached for a biscuit, Ingrid found herself moving too. The first bite of bacon was like tasting sin. Salt and fat and smoke flavors that had vanished from Germany years ago. She wanted to eat slowly to savor it, but her body had other plans. Her hands shook as she reached for more, and more, and more. "Easy there," one of the cowboys said, gently moving closer. "You'll make yourself sick eating too fast. Been there myself after a long cattle drive." Ingrid flinched, expecting a blow for her greed. But the cowboy, a young man probably no older than her brother would have been, just pushed the water pitcher closer to her. "Drink between bites. Helps it settle." This kindness was unbearable. It would have been easier if they had been cruel. Cruelty she could understand, could resist. But this casual concern from an enemy made no sense in the world she knew. Across the table, Helena watched Tom Blackwood talking with his ranch hands. They weren't discussing the prisoners like cargo or animals. They were planning the day's work, discussing which pastures needed attention, which fences required mending. And then she heard something that stopped her cold. "We'll need about 15 of the ladies for the East Field," Tom was saying. "Gentle work to start. Don't want them overdoing it after what they've been through." After what they've been through, as if their suffering mattered, as if they were people worthy of consideration. Sophie Richter, barely 21, suddenly broke down sobbing over her eggs. Great gasping sobs that shook her entire body. The cowboys looked alarmed, unsure what they had done wrong. But the other women understood. It wasn't sadness. It was the complete collapse of everything they had believed was true. "I wrote my last letter home 3 months ago." Sophie gasped between sobs. I told my mother I would die with honor rather than be captured. I said the Americans would torture us, that it would be worse than death. And now they're feeding us eggs. Eggs. Do you know how long it's been since my mother has seen an egg? The cultural collision was complete. On one side, American cowboys who had grown up with abundance as a birthright, who saw feeding hungry people as simple human decency. On the other, German women who had been raised in scarcity, indoctrinated with hate, prepared for torture, and instead finding themselves drowning in plenty. Tom Blackwood noticed the crying and walked over slowly. Through the translator, he asked, "Is the food all right? Is something wrong?" How could they explain? How could they tell him that his kindness was more devastating than cruelty, that every bite of biscuit was dismantling years of carefully constructed hatred? "The food is good," Helena managed to say, finding her voice for the first time. "We just didn't expect to be fed." Tom nodded, and there was something in his eyes that might have been pity or might have been understanding. "Well, out here in Texas, we don't let folks go hungry. Don't matter where they're from. Don't matter where they're from." As if nationality was no more important than hair color. As if being German, being the enemy, was just an incidental detail. The breakfast continued, and slowly the women began to talk among themselves. Not about escape or resistance, but about the food. The way the biscuits fell apart in layers. The perfect ratio of salt to fat in the bacon. The sweetness of the jam made from berries they couldn't identify. It was easier to focus on flavors than to confront the earthquake happening in their minds. Then came something even more disturbing. The cowboys began to clear their own plates, not ordering prisoners to do it, not leaving it for subordinates, but picking up their dishes and taking them to the kitchen themselves. One of them, an older man with gray in his mustache, even took Ingrid's empty plate with a nod and a touch of his hat brim. "Thank you for the help today, ma'am," he said through the translator, even though she hadn't done any work yet. "Appreciate you ladies coming out." Appreciate, as if they had a choice, as if they were volunteers rather than prisoners. The cognitive dissonance was making Helena dizzy. Everything she knew about the world, everything she had been taught about Americans, about enemies, about war itself was crumbling, like old bread in water. After breakfast, they were given work assignments. Not chain gangs or punishment details, but regular ranch work. Some would help in the kitchens. Others would work in the gardens. A few would assist with the lighter cattle work. They were given gloves to protect their hands, hats to shield them from the sun. Water buckets were placed strategically throughout the work areas so they could drink whenever they needed. Christina, still suspicious, whispered to Helena as they walked to their workstations, "They're fattening us up for something. This can't be real." But as the morning progressed, the pattern held. Cowboys worked alongside them, offering help when needed, showing them proper techniques, treating them with a casual respect that felt more shocking than any cruelty could have been. When Sophie struggled to lift a fence post, a young cowboy didn't bark orders or laugh at her weakness. Instead, he showed her how to use leverage, how to let the post's own weight work in her favor, how to protect her back while doing heavy labor. "Like this, ma'am, you don't fight the weight, you work with it." "Ma'am," he kept calling her ma'am. And when Ingrid was assigned to help with the horses, something inside her that had been dead since the war began stirred back to life. She had grown up helping her uncle with his small farm outside Munich. She knew animals, especially horses. There was a mare in the stable, young and skittish, recently broken, but still wild-eyed with fear. The kind of horse that reminded Ingrid of herself. She approached, slowly whispering in German the same words her uncle used to say. "Ruhig, ruhig, ich tu dir nicht weh." Calm, calm, I won't hurt you. And the horse, despite everything, despite the strangeness and the fear and the impossible situation, began to calm under her touch. Daniel Reeves, a 26-year-old cowboy who had been working the Blackwood Ranch since he was 16, stood watching from a distance. He'd been trying to gentle that mare for 3 weeks with limited success. He approached carefully, not wanting to spook the animal now that it was finally settling. "You've done this before," he said, more statement than question. Ingrid looked up, startled to be addressed directly. "My uncle," she replied in halting English. "Before the war, before everything changed." Daniel nodded slowly. "Well, you've got the touch. How'd you like to be our main horse handler? Same work credits, but you'd be working with the animals instead of the fences." Ingrid stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. A choice. He was offering her a choice about her own work, her own life, as if she were a person with agency rather than a prisoner without rights. She started, then stopped unsure of the English words. I would like that. Yes, thank you. Daniel smiled a genuine expression that reached his eyes. No, ma'am, thank you. That mayor's been giving me fits for weeks. You've got a gift. A gift, not a skill to be exploited, not a talent to be used until it broke, but a gift spoken with respect and gratitude. As the day progressed, the sun climbing high and hot over the Texas plains, Helena found herself working in the garden alongside Marianne Patterson, the ranch cook whose two sons were fighting in Europe, fighting against Germany, fighting against Helena's countrymen. Yet Marianne showed her which vegetables were ready for harvest, how to tell ripe from unripe, how to handle the plants without damaging them. She shared water from her canteen. She made jokes that the translators struggled to convey, but that still somehow communicated warmth and inclusion. At lunch, they ate together, not prisoners and guards in separate groups, but mixed. Cowboys and German women sitting at the same tables passing bread and butter, sharing the meal like ordinary workers on an ordinary day. It was the ordinariness of it that made it so extraordinary. By evening, when they were led back to the barracks, Helena was exhausted in a way she hadn't been since before the war. Not the exhaustion of fear or starvation or despair, but the honest tiredness that comes from a day of real work, real food, real human interaction. She collapsed onto her mattress and lay there staring at the ceiling as the last light of day faded from the windows. Around her, the other women were settling in, some talking quietly, some already asleep. Only Christina sat alone, arms wrapped around her knees, face set in grim determination. She had eaten that day, Helena knew, had finally given in to the hunger that was slowly killing her. But she had eaten the minimum, and now she sat like a sentinel, still guarding against some threat only she could see. Helena understood, because part of her was still waiting too, waiting for the trap to spring, waiting for the kindness to reveal itself as the elaborate prelude to greater cruelty. But another part of her, a part that was growing stronger with each meal, each small kindness, each moment of being treated as human, was beginning to ask a different question. What if this was real? What if everything she had been taught about America, about enemies, about the nature of war itself had been a lie from the beginning? It was a dangerous thought, the kind of thought that could unravel a person completely. Because if the propaganda had been false, if the Americans were capable of this kind of mercy, then what did that say about everything Germany had done, about the camps they had built, the people they had murdered, the war they had started? What did it say about Helena herself, who had served that system, who had believed those lies, who had sent other people to their deaths with her communications work? The guilt was almost worse than the hunger had been. Outside, the Texas night fell soft and warm, so different from the cold German nights she remembered. Crickets sang in the grass, cattle lowed in distant pastures, and somewhere a cowboy was playing a harmonica, the notes drifting across the ranch like a lullaby for a broken world. Helena closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to that moment at the table, to Tom Blackwood tearing bread in half and eating it himself to prove it wasn't poisoned, to the simple, devastating kindness of that gesture. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring more of the same, more food, more work, more of these Americans treating them with a decency that made no sense in the world as she understood it. And with each day, the foundations of her old beliefs would crack a little more, until eventually, inevitably, the whole structure would come tumbling down. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that, wasn't sure if anyone could be ready for the complete destruction of everything they thought they knew about the world. But ready or not, it was happening. The transformation had begun the moment that first piece of bread touched her tongue, and there was no going back now. Only forward into a future she couldn't yet imagine, guided by cowboys who showed mercy when they could have shown cruelty, who offered dignity when they could have offered degradation, who proved with every small kindness that the enemy was just another word for stranger, and strangers could become something else entirely if you gave them bread and called them ma'am. In the darkness of the barracks, as exhaustion finally pulled her under, Helena's last conscious thought was a question that would define everything that came after. If they could be this wrong about America, what else had they been wrong about? The answer would take months to fully reveal itself. But the question alone was already changing her, already remaking her into someone new. Someone who could look at an enemy and see a person who could accept kindness, without searching for the knife hidden behind it. Who could imagine a world where mercy was stronger than hate? It was just the first day. There would be many more to come. Days of work and food and small kindnesses that accumulated like stones in a wall, building something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. But this first day, this impossible day of being fed by those she had been taught to fear, would remain forever burned into her memory as the day the world turned upside down and everything she thought she knew came crashing down around her. And in the rubble of those old certainties, something new and fragile and impossibly hopeful began to grow. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Fuhrer of Nazi Germany had taken his own life in a Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in from all sides. Germany's unconditional surrender was expected within days, perhaps hours. The war in Europe was ending. Helena stood frozen, a dish towel clutched in her hands, trying to process what she was hearing. Around her, the other women wore expressions of profound confusion. No one cheered. No one cried. They simply stood there, suspended between two worlds belonging fully to neither. Sophie Richter, who had learned to ride horses and laugh again under the Texas sky, sank slowly into a chair. Her voice came out as a whisper. "It's over. The dying is done." But the relief in her voice was tangled with something else. Grief, perhaps, or shame, or the complex emotion that comes when you realize you've survived something that destroyed everyone you loved. Ingrid Weber turned away from the radio, her eyes distant. She had been working with the horses all morning, her hands still smelling of hay and leather, and for a moment she had forgotten there was a world beyond this ranch. Now it came flooding back. "My country is defeated," she said to no one in particular. "Everything we fought for is lost." Christina Muller, who had transformed so completely from the rigid ideologue she'd been 8 months ago, placed a hand on Ingrid's shoulder. Her face was calm, almost serene in a way that suggested she'd already made peace with this moment long before it arrived. "No," Christina said quietly. "Everything we were told to fight for was a lie. We didn't lose, we woke up." Helena found herself nodding, though the motion felt strange, almost disloyal. She thought of her mother dead in the Hamburg firestorm, her father still missing, her sister Margaret starving in the ruins. They had all paid the price for that lie. Should she feel sad? She didn't feel sad. She felt relieved, and the relief made her feel guilty, and the guilt made her angry at herself for feeling anything at all. Tom Blackwood stood at the edge of the room, his hat in his hands, giving them space to process. When the silence had stretched long enough, he cleared his throat gently. "Ladies," he said, his Texas drawl softer than usual, "war's over. You'll be going home when transport can be arranged. Back to your families." Home. The word landed differently for each of them. For Helena, it meant ruins and starvation and a sister she might not recognize. For Ingrid, it meant a mother and younger sister she hadn't seen in over a year. For all of them, it meant leaving behind the only place in the world where they'd felt safe since the war began. 2 weeks later, on Victory in Europe Day, the nearby town of Herne erupted in celebration. American flags hung from every building. People danced in the streets. Car horns honked in jubilant chaos. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally impossibly over. At the Blackwood Ranch, the mood was quieter. The women understood that while Americans celebrated victory, they were mourning defeat. And yet the defeat felt less like an ending and more like a strange kind of liberation. That evening, as the sun painted the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold, Daniel Reeves found Ingrid by the horse corral. She was brushing down her favorite mare, the one she'd gentled in those first weeks, her movements slow and meditative. He'd been rehearsing this moment for days, but now that it was here, the words felt clumsy in his mouth. "Ingrid," he started, then stopped. Started again. "I know this is crazy. I know we've only known each other a few months, but these have been the best months of my life." She didn't turn around, but he saw her hands still on the brush. "I've been saving," he continued. "Not much, but enough for this." He pulled a small box from his pocket. The ring inside was simple, a thin band of gold with a tiny stone that caught the dying light. It was all he could afford on a ranch hand's salary, but it was real and it was his to give. "Stay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marry me. Build a life here." Ingrid finally turned, and the look on her face nearly broke him. It was longing and impossibility mixed together, the expression of someone who wanted something desperately but knew she couldn't have it. "Daniel," she said, her German accent thicker than usual with emotion, I love you, I do. But my mother is in Munich, my younger sister. Last letter said they were living in one room with two other families. No food, no heat, no hope. She took a step closer, close enough that he could see tears gathering in her eyes. I can't build a life here while they die there. I can't abandon them. Family is everything. Daniel nodded throat tight. He'd known this was coming. Had known it from the moment the radio announced Germany's surrender. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. I understand, he said, and meant it. Family first. That's how it should be. When they stood there in the fading light, two people from different worlds who'd found each other in the strangest circumstances, knowing their time together was measured in days now, not months. After, Ingrid said it suddenly, after I find them, after things settle, maybe then I could come back. Daniel wanted to say yes, wanted to promise he'd wait forever if that's what it took. But he was a practical man, and he knew what war did to promises. I'll be here, he said simply, at this ranch, working these horses. If you can come back, I'll be here. They held each other as the sun set, and neither of them spoke of the impossibility of what they were hoping for. The weeks that followed had a dreamlike quality, as if everyone was moving through water. The women continued their work, but the rhythm had changed. They were no longer prisoners settling into a new life. They were temporary visitors preparing to leave. The Cowboys started giving them things, small gifts, tokens of something none of them knew quite how to name. Jake Morrison, the older cowboy who'd been deaf since the first war, spent his evenings carving. He gave Sophie a wooden horse so detailed you could see the individual muscles beneath the surface. So, you remember, he said through the translator, and Sophie clutched it to her chest and cried. Marianne Patterson pulled Helena aside in the kitchen one afternoon and pressed a stack of recipe cards into her hands. Each one was written in careful block letters, the instructions precise and loving. Cornbread, Marianne said, pointing to the first card. Biscuits, apple pie. You make these in Germany when you can find the ingredients. And you remember us. Helena tried to refuse, feeling she didn't deserve such kindness, but Marianne was insistent. You girls worked hard. You earned your place here. Don't you forget that. Christina spent her last weeks learning everything she could from Dr. Robert Chen, the Chinese-American physician who'd saved her life. He taught her about trauma care, about treating malnutrition, about the psychological wounds that would need healing in the years to come. You're going back to a broken country, he told her during their final session. It'll need healers more than it ever needed soldiers. You can be that healer. He wrote her a letter of recommendation, sealed it in an envelope, and handed it to her with both hands. Thank you, Christina said, her voice thick with emotion, for saving my life, for saving my soul. Dr. Chen smiled, the same gentle smile he'd worn when she was delirious with fever, calling him names she now couldn't bear to remember. We save each other, he said. That's what humans do when we remember we're human. August arrived with a heat that shimmered off the Texas plains like water, and with it came the trucks. They appeared on a Tuesday morning, olive green and official, driven by soldiers who looked too young to have seen the war's ending. The women had known this day was coming, had been preparing for it, but preparation didn't make it easier. They packed their few belongings in small bags, everything they owned in the world fitting into spaces hardly bigger than loaves of bread. They dressed in the clothes they'd arrived in, though the uniforms fit differently now on bodies that had filled out with months of good food and hard work. The Cowboys gathered in the yard, standing in a loose semicircle, hats in hands. No one seemed to know what to say. How do you say goodbye to people who'd been enemies and became something else entirely? What words exist for that kind of transformation? Tom Blackwood stepped forward, his weathered face more lined than usual, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears if he'd allowed himself to cry. Ladies, he started, then had to clear his throat and start again. You worked hard here, earned every bit of respect we gave you. You came as prisoners, but you leave as friends. Texas will remember you. We'll remember you. He turned to Helena, who stood at the front of the group, and handed her an envelope. She opened it with trembling fingers and found $200 in neat bills, every penny of the work credit she'd earned over 8 months. I can't, she protested. This is too much. You earned it, Tom said firmly. Now go help your family. One by one, the Cowboys said their goodbyes. Some shook hands, some hugged. Samuel Hughes, who'd taught them how to mend fences and told them stories about his grandfather's ranch, gave each woman a bandana from his own collection. Texas colors, he said gruffly. so you don't forget where you learned to work. When it was time to board the trucks, the movement felt both too fast and too slow. Ingrid was one of the last to climb in, Daniel standing beside the truck bed holding her hand until the last possible moment. He pressed a sealed letter into her palm. "Don't read it till you're on the ship," he said. "Please." She nodded, unable to speak, and then the truck was pulling away. The women crowded at the back, watching through the dust as the ranch grew smaller. The cowboys stood in a line waving. Some were crying openly now, and so were the women. "We're leaving paradise to return to hell," Sophie whispered, and no one disagreed. The journey back across the Atlantic was nothing like the journey that had brought them to America. This time they traveled above deck. This time there was food, but the abundance felt hollow now, tainted by what they knew was waiting on the other side. Ingrid waited 3 days before opening Daniel's letter. She sat on the deck as the ship cut through calm seas, the sun warm on her face, and unfolded the pages with hands that shook. His handwriting was careful, each letter formed with the concentration of someone who hadn't spent much time writing. "My dearest Ingrid," he'd written, "by the time you read this, you'll be crossing the ocean back to a home you probably don't recognize anymore. I want you to know that these months with you were the happiest of my life. I understand why you have to go. Family is everything. Never doubt that you made the right choice. If you can write to me, even if you can't come back, I need to know you are safe. I'll be waiting at the Blackwood Ranch, however long it takes. The horses miss you already. With all my love, Daniel. P.S. Your mare had a foal last week. I named her Helena after your friend. Seemed fitting since she's got your spirit gentle but strong." Ingrid held the letter to her chest and looked out at the endless water. Somewhere ahead lay Germany. Somewhere behind lay Texas. And she was suspended between them, belonging fully to neither, carrying pieces of both in her heart. The contrast grew sharper with every mile. When they'd crossed this ocean a year ago, they'd left a Europe burning. Now they were returning to a Europe that had burned out, leaving only ashes. The repatriation center in France was chaos. Thousands of people moving in every direction, trying to find their way home to places that no longer existed. The German women were processed efficiently but without kindness. No one was cruel, but no one was particularly kind either. They were just another problem to be solved, another group of displaced people in a world full of displaced people. The train journey into Germany revealed the full scope of the destruction. Every city they passed through was ruins, not damaged, not partially destroyed, but obliterated, reduced to rubble and broken stone and twisted metal. The countryside fared better, but even there you could see the scars. Burned fields, empty villages, roads cratered by bombs. Sophie stared out the window, her face pale. This was the fatherland they'd been told to defend with their lives. This was what their sacrifices had protected. "Was it always this bad?" she asked. "Did we just not see it?" Helena shook her head. "We saw what they wanted us to see. The propaganda showed us Germany strong, Germany victorious. They never showed us this." When the train finally reached Hamburg, or what remained of it, Helena felt her stomach drop. She'd known it would be bad. The letters from Margaret had prepared her, but knowing and seeing were different things. The city was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Mountains of rubble stretched as far as she could see. Here and there the shell of a building still stood, walls intact but hollow like the skeleton of some great beast picked clean by vultures. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and gray and hopeless. She spent 3 days searching for Margaret. 3 days of showing a photograph to anyone who'd look, asking if they'd seen a girl of 19, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen in the Northern District. Most people just shook their heads and moved on. Everyone was looking for someone. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, an old woman sitting in the doorway of a collapsed building pointed down the street. "Hildegard's place," she said, "or what's left of it. Basement's still standing. Some people living there." Helena found it more by instinct than direction. The building that had once stood there was now just a pile of bricks, but stairs led down to what had been the basement, and from below came the faint sound of voices. She descended carefully, the stairs cracked and unstable. The basement was dim, lit by a single candle, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she saw perhaps 15 people crowded into a space meant for storing wine. They lay on thin blankets, their belongings in small piles, their faces gaunt with hunger. And there in the corner, sitting with her back against the wall, was Margaret. Helena barely recognized her. The girl she'd left behind had been 17, plump-cheeked, full of life despite the war. The woman she was looking at was ancient, her face all ankles and shadows, her eyes too large for her skull. Margaret, Helena's voice came out as a whisper. The woman's head turned slowly as if the movement took great effort. Recognition dawned, gradually followed by disbelief, followed by something that might have been joy, if there was enough energy left for joy. Helena, she said, and the word was a question, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Are you real? Helena crossed the space between them in 3 strides and fell to her knees. They embraced, both crying, both holding on, as if the other might disappear if they let go. I'm here, Helena kept saying. I'm here, I'm real, I'm alive. They stayed like that for a long time, 2 sisters reunited in the ruins of their world. Around them, the other inhabitants of the basement watched with the weary indifference of people who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret's hands were still gripping Helena's arms, as if to reassure herself this wasn't a hallucination born of starvation. Mama, Margaret asked, though her eyes said she already knew the answer. Gone, Helena confirmed, in the July bombing, and Papa is still missing. Margaret nodded, tears sliding down her hollow cheeks. I thought you were dead too. Your letters stopped coming. And the things they said about the camps in America, about what happened to prisoners, I thought. I know, Helena said. I know what they said. It was all lies, Margaret. All of it. She reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope Tom Blackwood had given her. 200 American dollars. In Germany's collapsed economy, it was a fortune. We're going to survive this, Helena said, pressing the money into her sister's hands. We're going to rebuild. I learned some things in Texas about baking, about making something from nothing. We'll start a bakery. A small one at first, but it'll grow. Margaret stared at the money, then at her sister, then back at the money, as if trying to process something that made no sense in the world as she knew it. The Americans gave you this, she asked. Why poem? Because I earned it, Helena said simply. They paid me for my work, just like they'd pay anyone. Over the following weeks, Helena told Margaret everything. About the ship and the starvation and the fear, about the feast they'd refused to eat, about Tom Blackwood and the Cowboys and Marianne's kindness, about learning to work on a ranch and feeling human again, about discovering that the enemy was just another word for stranger, and strangers could become friends if you gave them a chance. Margaret listened to it all with wide eyes, occasionally interrupting to ask if Helena was sure if she hadn't been tricked somehow, if it was really true that the Americans had been kind. It's true, Helena said. I know it sounds impossible, but it's true. Using Tom's money, they rented a small space in one of the less damaged buildings. Helena used Marianne's recipes, adapting them for the ingredients they could find. Cornbread made with whatever grain was available. Biscuits when they could get flour. Simple things, but made with care and love, and the techniques she'd learned in Texas. Germans came cautiously at first, suspicious of these strange American-style breads. But when they tasted them, when they experienced food made with abundance in mind, even in the midst of scarcity, they came back. Helena's English, learned from cowboys and ranch hands, made her valuable to the American occupation forces. Within months, she was working as a translator, helping bridge the gap between conquerors and conquered. American officers who heard she'd been in Texas would smile and nod. Good people down there, they'd say. They treat folks right. And Helena would agree, thinking of bacon and biscuits and a cowboy who'd torn bread in half to prove it wasn't poisoned. Christina found work with the Red Cross using everything Dr. Chen had taught her. She saved lives instead of taking them healed wounds, instead of inflicting them. In letters to Helena, she wrote about finding purpose in the ruins, about how sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what really matters. Sophie married a British soldier and moved to London. She kept Jake Morrison's carved horse on her mantle for the rest of her life. When her children asked about it, she'd tell them about the deaf cowboy who'd shown her kindness when the world was ending. And Ingrid stayed in Munich. She found her mother and sister living in conditions similar to what Helena had found in Hamburg. She worked odd jobs, scrounged for food, did whatever it took to keep them alive. And every month without fail, she wrote to Daniel Reeves at the Blackwood Ranch in Texas. His letters came back faithfully, filled with news of the horses and the ranch and the life that continued there. He never pressured her to return, never complained about the waiting. He just kept writing, keeping that connection alive across the ocean and the years. In 1950, Ingrid's mother passed away, her body finally giving up after years of malnutrition and stress. In 1951, Ingrid's sister married and moved to Berlin to start a new life. And in 1952, Ingrid bought a one-way ticket to America. She arrived at the Blackwood Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a single suitcase and a heart full of hope and fear. Daniel was in the horse corral working with a young mare, and he didn't see her approach. "You were always better with the horse than I was," Ingrid said in English. That was much improved from 7 years before. He turned, and the look on his face made the 7 years of waiting worth it. "You came back," he said, his voice full of wonder. "I promised I would," she replied, "eventually." They married a month later in a small ceremony at the ranch. The following spring, their daughter was born, and they named her Margaret after Helena's sister. Helena learned about the marriage from a letter that arrived in 1952. She was 31 years old now, owner of a successful bakery that employed 12 people. The letter was from Tom Blackwood, forwarded through several channels before finding her in Hamburg. "Dear Helena," it read in Tom's careful handwriting. "Saw your name in a newspaper article about Hamburg reconstruction. Reporter mentioned a baker who makes American-style cornbread. I figured that had to be you. Glad you're doing well. Glad your sister found you. Life at the ranch continues. We still talk about you ladies sometimes. Marianne says hello and hopes you remember how to make proper cornbread because she's particular about her recipes. Daniel Reeves married your friend Ingrid last year. She came back and they're expecting their first child this spring. He's the happiest I've ever seen him. The ranch is still here if you ever want to visit. You'll always have a home in Texas. Your friend, Thomas Blackwood." Helena read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she sat down and wrote a response telling Tom about the bakery and Margaret and the life they'd built from the ruins. She ended with a promise. Someday when Germany was fully rebuilt, when she could leave the bakery in capable hands, she would return to visit. She wanted to see the ranch again. She wanted to thank him in person for saving not just her life, but her faith in human goodness. 3 years later, in 1955, she kept that promise. The flight to America was her first time on an airplane, and she spent most of it looking out the window, marveling at how small the world looked from above, how the borders that had meant so much during the war were invisible from this height. She rented a car in Houston and drove to Hearne, following roads she remembered from that first impossible journey in 1944. The landscape was the same, vast and beautiful and untouched, as if the war had been a bad dream that never reached these shores. The Blackwood Ranch looked exactly as she remembered it. The same white fences, the same long barn, the same house where Tom had fed them that first night. She parked the car and stood for a moment, breathing in the smell of grass and cattle and Texas earth, letting the memories wash over her. Tom Blackwood came out of the barn, older now, his hair more gray than brown, but still with that same gentle strength in his bearing. He stopped when he saw her, squinted in the sunlight, then his face broke into a smile. "Helena Schmidt," he said, walking toward her. "Well, I'll be damned." They embraced, and Helena felt 10 years of tension leave her shoulders. She was home. Not the home she was born to, but the home she'd chosen, the home that had chosen her when she needed it most. Ingrid and Daniel were there along with their daughter Margaret, a beautiful child of 3 with blonde hair and her father's gentle eyes. Ingrid hugged Helena so tightly neither of them could breathe, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. "I can't believe you're here," Ingrid kept saying. "I can't believe it." "I promised Tom I'd come back," Helena said, "and I keep my promises now." That evening they held a barbecue. Many of the original Cowboys were still there, older but recognizable. Samuel Hughes, now in his 60s, Jake Morrison, still deaf, still carving, and Marianne Patterson, retired but still passionate about her recipes. Helena made a batch of cornbread under Marianne's supervision, and when the older woman tasted it, tears gathered in her eyes. "You remembered," she said softly. "You actually remembered." "How could I forget?" Helena replied. "You saved my life with this recipe." As the sun set, painting the Texas sky in those familiar shades of orange and gold, Helena and Tom found themselves sitting on the fence by the horse corral, just as they had 11 years before. "You saved my life," Helena said quietly. "All of our lives." We just fed you some meals, Tom replied. Taught you some ranch work. No, Helena said firmly. You gave us back our humanity. You showed us that enemies are just people, and people deserve kindness. After everything Nazi Germany did, you could have been cruel. You chose mercy instead. Tom was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land he'd worked his whole life. My granddaddy taught me something, he finally said. Hate's easy. Kindness takes courage. Seemed like you ladies needed courage more than hate. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. Helena thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Hamburg to Texas to Hamburg and back to Texas again. From prisoner to person. From enemy to friend. She thought about Margaret back in Germany, running the bakery, carrying on what they'd built together. She thought about Christina healing others and herself. She thought about Sophie in London with her carved horse and her memories. She thought about all 30 women who'd stood in that mess hall on that impossible first night, too scared to eat the feast that had been offered. And she thought about the choice those cowboys had made to show mercy when they could have shown cruelty, to offer dignity when they could have offered degradation, to feed their enemies and call them ma'am and treat them like human beings worthy of respect. That choice had changed everything. Not just for 30 German women, but for the ripples those women had sent out into the world. Every person Christina healed. Every child Sophie raised with kindness. Every loaf of bread Helena baked with love. Every horse Ingrid gentled with patience. All of it traced back to that first moment when Tom Blackwood had torn a piece of bread in half and offered it to a starving enemy, proving with that simple gesture that mercy was stronger than hate, that kindness could survive, even war, that enemies were just people who'd been taught to fear each other, and people could unlearn fear if you gave them half a chance. As the last light faded from the sky and the crickets began their evening song, Helena made a silent promise. She would carry this story for the rest of her life. She would tell it to anyone who would listen. She would make sure the world knew that even in humanity's darkest moment, there were people who chose light. She would remember the Cowboys of Texas who showed her that the enemy was just another word for stranger. And strangers could become family if you fed them and taught them and treated them with the dignity every human being deserved. She would remember, and in remembering, she would ensure that their mercy had not been given in vain. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that shone on Germany and Texas and every place in between. And under their ancient light, a woman who'd learned to unlearn hate sat with a man who'd taught her how, and between them stretched the invisible threads of all the lives they'd touched, all the people they'd changed, all the mercy they'd proven possible in a world that had forgotten what mercy meant. It was not the ending she'd expected when she'd boarded that ship in 1944, starving and terrified, and certain she was going to die. But it was the ending she'd earned through every meal eaten, every fence mended, every moment of choosing to trust when trust seemed impossible. And it was in every way that mattered the perfect ending. Not because everything was fixed or healed or made right, but because it proved that even after everything, after all the horror and death and destruction, humans could still choose to be human, could still choose mercy over cruelty, kindness over hate, love over fear. And sometimes when the night was dark enough and the stars bright enough, that simple choice was all it took to change the world.